Welcome to Raconte un peu, Khabarni Shuway, Tell Me More. We're very happy to have Dr. Khater. Dr. Khater is a professor of history at North Carolina State University and the director of the Khayrallah Center for the Lebanese Diaspora Studies. Dr. Khater, Sandra and I were very happy to be here with you.
Dr. Khater, thank you so much for being with us today in Raconte un peu. So if you please quote us or tell us a little more about your journey.
Of course. First of all, thank you so much for hosting me. It's a privilege to be with you today, and it's a pleasure to speak with both of you. Like many Lebanese in the 20th century, and I guess 21st century, we all have a story of migration, or if we personally have not migrated, we have a close relative or a distant relative who have migrated. So it's, as my colleague Ghassan Haj calls it, it's part of our DNA to move. For me personally, I grew up and was raised in Lebanon, and I left Lebanon in 1978. At the time, I left because I received a scholarship to go to the United States to pursue a degree in engineering. Like every good Arab boy, you study medicine or engineering. And so I was sick of blood, so I decided I'll be an engineer. And
Or
I
a
left.
lawyer. Or a lawyer.
Or a lawyer, it's true. But usually you don't go abroad to study law, but it's engineering for me anyway. And I was very fortunate because my family comes from a very modest means, and there was no way that they could afford to send me overseas. So I had received the scholarship. And I left. And I left, I was very young. I was 17. In many ways, my life had two parts, really, before that. That is the part before the war and then the part of the war. The part before the war, not to get too romantic about that period, but certainly it was a very bucolic period. It was a period in which things were really fantastic. Life was good. Even for those who are of more modest means in Lebanon, you lived a good life, good food, good family, and so on and so forth. And I think in many ways the war kind of destroyed all of that. I think it kind of robbed many of us at that time period, and the wars of Lebanon continue to do so, robbed me of my childhood, my teenage years anyway, when you would grow a normal life, so to speak. And it set me off on two journeys. One is obviously what I said, which is educational journey. That is, how will I get a degree and the scholarship part. But two, actually, it's a journey to try to understand Lebanon myself and my relationship to Lebanon, because there was a disruption of what's normal. Again, we don't even know anymore what is normal because this is constantly being disrupted. The very fabric of existence, our society, of our daily lives is constantly being shredded by violence and bombs. And the things that I grew up before the war all of a sudden made no sense after the war, right? How people behaved before the war, the multi-religious community that I grew up in which you didn't talk about whether you're a Dirzi or Masihi or Muslim. You talked about, do you play soccer well, or did you go see this movie? All of that was disrupted, and that violence, and even the adults who were anchors in my life, including my father and all the men in the neighborhood who I thought were capable of managing the world, and all of a sudden I begin to see them as morally different than I had grew up with. They were willing to accept certain things about other that are happening that are very violent. Anyway, all of that made no sense to me, and I just didn't have the tools at that point to understand it. So as I said, I left really to get a degree, but I also left in many ways, and it set me off a journey to try to understand Lebanon, what happened, myself, my relationship to it. And I did my degree in engineering. I started out in St. Paul, Minnesota, at a small liberal arts college called McAllister College, but then I ended up in California at California Polytechnic, where I got my electrical engineering degree. And I worked as an engineer for a while. But throughout my education, it just was never satisfying. It wasn't really what I wanted to do. As within the educational system, once you take exams, they say you go scientifique or matalam, or at least I got enough grades to do matalam, but it's not that I really was convinced that's where I wanted to go. And it's interesting because the courses that really grabbed my attention were humanities courses, specifically women and gender studies courses. To be very honest, I took one class because they told me there are a lot of girls in the class. But from day one, all of a sudden, it's like somebody turned on a light bulb, because I found these courses with feminist theory and feminist scholarship to be very powerful in trying to understand things, especially not just matters of gender, but it's also more than that. And so even as I was doing my undergraduate, I really just was not feeling that this is what I wanted to do. And so finally, I decided to take a jump And in many ways, to be honest, both of my parents died within a year after I came to the United States. My father died first, then
Wow.
my mom died on just after church. They came back, and my mom passed away. So it was a bit of a very emotional shock.
Wow.
And in some
Wow.
ways, it completely unmoored me because I couldn't go back from funerals. But at the same time, all of a sudden I have all this space and I wanted, so it was at one hand, you become unmoored, on the other hand, you can explore. So I felt comfortable enough to drop out of being an engineer, although the money was good, of course. And then I pursued a PhD in Middle Eastern history because I found that in many ways, that's the only way I'm going to be able to understand not only what happened in Lebanon, but what continues to happen in Lebanon and try to make a sense of it. And that's what started my academic journey as a historian. And actually, the biggest shock is that I arrive here. So I arrive with a notion of who I am. I arrive with a notion of what my culture is. I arrive with a notion of this incredibly long history as somebody who is Lebanese, somebody who's Arab, who's very proud of both identities, of the history that we have. And all of a sudden, I arrive in a country that at best finds me exotic, but at worst has a label called terrorist. And that I don't recognize the image that is being projected onto me, whether it's by questions by well-meaning people, stupid questions, if you will, like, do you guys have cars? Do you ride camels? That kind of racist exoticism, to far more flagrant racism when they kind of see Arabs as nothing but the other, that alien other that harbors ill feelings to America and acts upon those feelings through violence, and that's all we know, right? That whether it is popular culture depictions or politicians speaking or obviously the Middle East conflict that we have all grown up with. And so all of those things, all of a sudden, I'm like looking at this and going, this is not who we are. So literally from day one of arriving till this moment, I spent my life and my career trying to say, look, this is who we are. We're human beings at one basic level, which seemed to be one of the most shocking things is that we actually have to prove that we are human beings. Human beings
Yes.
that are as varied as any other group of people, that we have good people, bad people, that even the same individual could be complex, that we have this incredibly amazing culture that has produced fantastic literature, food, art, theater, film, anything you name it, that we're just not, that this is a culture that is given so much to this world. And all of a sudden, all of that is dismissed to the side. And so you spend a lot of my time, both, first of all, as kind of a student, if you will, and then when I became a professor teaching the history of the Middle East, that became part of the journey that I wanted, as a political activist as well for a variety of causes. And so this idea of reclaiming a sense of humanity for Arabs and Arab Americans became to me kind of a journey. And in the process, also discovering, trying to understand in myself of how do you explain the fact that Lebanon collapsed into this incredible violence? How do you explain to them that is not the totality of our history, that's not totality of who we are, that even amidst the violence, there are people who are doing amazing things. In fact, that's what I try to bring across. I say, look, this region we live in, the Middle East, and this country that I come from, Lebanon, has suffered so much. Other societies would never recover. And yet we are forced to recreate and recreate. Not that we have to, but we do it. And it's a testament to our humanity. And so that's, I think, the biggest cultural shock for me that I kind of experienced. At the same time, then I'm looking from the outside and I'm changing myself, right? Every journey we take, whatever the journey is, whether it is from village to city or from country, Lebanon, outside, it changes us. It changes our senses of who we are. I began to ask questions, for example, about gender relations in Lebanon, just because I took classes on it and I couldn't understand some of the element of patriarchal society in Lebanon. The things that I grew up with in my home, certain politics that all of a sudden from a distance weren't making sense. So in some ways, as one person said, you can never go home. Once you immigrate, it changes you. And you exist in this liminal space where you're never fully American, but you're never fully Lebanese anymore, and you kind of float in between. And sometimes that's amazing because you can become a bridge. But the problem with bridges is that people step over you, and it's exhausting at times to try to explain both elements. So that's another element of what I think would be the cultural shock, is that myself, so not only am I in this larger society that is attacking me in small and large ways, but also that myself, I'm changing through this journey that I'm undertaking. And Lebanon is beginning to feel a little bit very familiar in many ways, but also not familiar in other ways. I'll share with you a story about this kind of racism in America, because it was my second year here, and I lived in a fairly poor neighborhood because I didn't have a whole lot of money. And I was going shopping, and I didn't have a car, so I was walking, and I would always walk past this bar, biker bar, the very kind of stereotypical Hells Angels kind of thing. It's just these guys drinking beer, leather vests, big hogs, motorcycles, Harley Davidsons. And I was walking, and this scrawny little boy, I was all of 18, 19 maybe, no, 18 and a half I was. And this was after the Iranian Revolution. So Khomeini is saying death to America, and I'm walking past them, and I start hearing their voices rise, and they're saying something. At first, I didn't know they were talking to me, but clearly it became evident that they're really attacking me because they thought I was Iranian, right? So I had these two bags, and I became alarmed because they were coming at me, and I thought this is not going to end well. And so I'm running, which is the only advantage I have over them, is that I'm thinner and I can still run. And things are flying out of my bags, and I'm turning back and I'm saying to them, I'm not Iranian, I'm Lebanese. And in retrospect, I started laughing because as if it's going to make any difference to them, because all they are seeing is this other Middle Eastern person, and they're taking out all their aggression and racism. And I think that's part of what a lot of us think about, if you will. The United States, as Pauline knows, has a lot of advantages and a lot of opportunities, and I'm grateful for every one of them. But as a friend of mine said, who's also Lebanese, said, it leaves you with scars. You work hard, you have opportunity, but you also come away with a lot of these scars that are part of this process that I'm talking about.
Okay, among those scars is the feeling that we always think there is an illusion that we are going to return eventually to Lebanon. Can you explain a little bit? Actually, is the illusion the same today than it was in the past?
I think so. I think we share a lot with the people who came in the 1880s, 1890s. There's advantage of phones, there's advantage of this, Zoom or what have you. But at the same time, I think we all had the same desire. I think the early immigrants, most of them, came with the notion they're going to come here and make money and then go back to have the good life in Lebanon, right? I think very few people leave with a sense of permanence, honestly. I don't think you think of it clearly. I certainly didn't. I thought I'm going to come here, get my degree, and go home. And in fact, I tried, by the way. I tried to go back home and get a job as an engineer, but there weren't that many jobs in Lebanon. It's in the midst of an extent, and that pulls you in all sorts of directions. But the truth of the matter is, I have to say that whether we're talking about the 1880s or whether we're talking about 2025, we all, and I'm speaking all meaning the people who immigrated, live in both worlds. There's a sense of simultaneity about it. Imagine for a moment somebody living in Oklahoma City in 1903, and they just got a shipment of burghul from New York City, from a place called Shhades, right? And they're touching that burghul. They're kind of feeling it in their hands. And that moment, that incredibly tactile moment, the smell of the burghul when you put it in water as you're trying to make tabbouleh. And there's a festival, by the way, in Kansas City, Tabbouleh Festival, that dates back to 50 years ago. That moment is going to take you straight back to when you grew up with eating tabbouleh in the village or in the town or in the city, right? I mean, so yeah, you are in Oklahoma, but there's something there that just kind of, so you're never whole. You are never whole. And I think there's this wonderful sculpture by a French artist. It's called The Immigrant, and the backdrop is, I forgot which bay it's located at, and the person is wearing a hat and carrying two suitcases, but the person's body has holes in it. Because when you leave something behind. We are never whole. And so, Pauline, when you ask that question, it is, yeah, we're always trying to fill that hole in our hearts, in our souls, in our minds. And I don't think it's possible to fill it, honestly. I think it's very difficult to fill it. But at the same time, we discover new things. We become new people. And what I really like about it all is that at the same time, as we, whether we're talking about earlier immigrants or current immigrants, as we go back and forth personally, electronically, via letters, or even telegram, or whether we ship things back or not, it changes Lebanon as well, right? If you think about something as simple as somebody who opens up a clinic or school, they're living in Brazil, but they contribute money and they set up a health clinic. That is beginning to transform what Lebanon is. Or if somebody returns to Lebanon, we estimate about 36% of immigrants who left between 1880 and 1924, 30% of them go back to Lebanon. Well, they bring back with them habits and material objects. In fact, the very thing we call the Lebanese house, Beit El Amid, which we all kind of adore, right? Well, that is actually an immigrant house, because the only way you could build it, immigrants would come back and invest in a house like that to show the money they made. And so they transform Lebanon, they shape it. And I think, to me, what is really has always been interesting, both personally and professionally, is that dynamic between the diaspora community and Lebanon. And the only way I can understand it is that Lebanon does not exist without its immigrants, and immigrants cannot exist without Lebanon. There is a symbiotic relationship, not always positive, by the way, right? It's not always, yes, it's all lovely and idyllic. Sometimes it's tension-filled. We read letters from immigrants in, let's say, West Africa to their family in Bet El, right, in which they are sending them money because the family needs money. This is from 1907. And then there's tension-filled. What are you doing with the money, right? Tension that is exacerbated by the distance and the lack of face-to-face communications. So I don't want to romanticize this, but at the same time, these relationships are so interesting to me. And you cannot understand Lebanon without those relationship to the diaspora. And you cannot understand anybody who's in the diaspora without their links to Lebanon. I think that's what's really always been impressive. And that's the thing that I always look for.
Okay, so very interesting. Let's talk about women in this special case. So نحن بنعرف قديش صار في كمان يعني موجة هجرة المرأة اللبنانية فلت، يعني مش بس الرجال فلوا، صح؟ كمان النسوان فلوا. سو يما بركي في كتير رجال اجوا وبهدف بس يتجوزوا من مرأة لبنانية يعني ويرجعوا. هيدا الشيء قديش أثر على، خلينا نقول يعني الستركتور تبع العائلة اللبنانية من وراء هالموفمون ماسيف تبع الهجرة اللي صار. أنا عم بحكي عم باخدها بس يعني هون بس تقلك فعلا من ناحية دور المرأة، إن كان باسيف ولا اكتف. يعني إذا بنعتبر باسيف انتر جيمي لما اجوا جابوها من بلادها حتى تروح على بلاد الهجرة، ولا هي كمان تشجعت وهاجرت؟
So first of all, we was a gambler, he was in debt, and he was an alcoholic, and potentially maybe he abused her through domestic violence. But that's probably one of the most extreme cases. You also see that for some women, their husbands are unable to, like there's this very case that I studied of a woman from Zahli, her husband, he had physical ailments, he couldn't go himself, but they were economically not doing well, and her brothers had already left, so she follows them, right? And she never comes back because she discovers a level of freedom that to a certain extent she did not have in Zahli. And we have the letters, her husband saying, when are you coming back? And she keeps postponing. And she never actually goes back. So I think regardless of whether they are going because they're married or family reunification or they take an adventure on their own, their arrival in new spaces in which everybody has to work. Because these people didn't come here on vacation. They came and they worked themselves, they literally sometimes worked themselves to death, right? It was just hard work. Everybody had to work to make ends meet because we have this image that it was so easy and they all made a lot of money. That's not true. A lot of them faced a very hard life, including living in very cramped conditions where when you look at tenement housing in New York or in Kentucky, they were living 8-10 people to 1 or 2 rooms with no ventilation, horrible sanitation. There's malnutrition. We're doing a study about migration and health, and we're discovering shockingly that there's quite a bit of malnutrition because they didn't have money to eat as much, and especially the women, because they would starve themselves so their children would have food, right? But at the same time, because they are all of a sudden working in factories or working as peddlers. If you went to Lawrence, Massachusetts, for example, practically every young woman worked in a textile factory. On one hand, it was horrendous work conditions. It was very loud. You could lose a part of your hand or your foot, and just really hard work. You developed a lot of pulmonary issues because you worked with textiles and all that fine stuff. Nobody was wearing masks. Nobody was worried about health. It was very difficult lives. So on one hand, there was that, but on the other hand, they begin to get money. And all of a sudden, in the United States, which is a capitalist nation, money means some level of power over decision making.
Of course.
And so you begin to see an element in which these women are beginning to feel there's a space for them, that they can apply greater pressure to renegotiate what I like to call the patriarchal contract, which is women do this, men do that, and this is what happens. All of that goes out of the window because everybody's doing different things. Men, especially, in fact, we find that a lot of men are finding it harder to integrate. Women tend to find it easier to integrate into this new society because they are much better at creating a social network. Men are not as good at it. We find that women actually learn language faster than men. So there are advantages they're finding. And then, of course, at the same time, then and now, there's a greater degree of feminist movements. At that time, it was called the suffragettes or the suffragist movement, the vote to try to get the vote for women. Here nowadays, we, of course, have a different thing, including queer rights. And so I think you begin to see these spaces in which they can enter and claim greater sense of power over their lives. At the same time that they face a lot of challenges. Again, I don't like to romanticize these things. So I think that journey that we're talking about for women begins to create moments in which they are seeking more, to reshape who they are. So there's a greater conversation about should women get education all of a sudden, right? And you see, especially amongst middle class Lebanese immigrants to the United States, they're making the arguments that you should not have arranged marriages. It should be romantic love between a man and a woman, and a woman has the right to choose. The woman has the right to an education. The woman can do anything a man can do. And this is all happening like in the early 1900s. And so that begins to change a lot of things. And all of a sudden you see them going and becoming part of the military during World War I and then World War II. So clearly this immigrant experience changes it, and we begin to see them play a greater role within the community than perhaps you would see if they stayed in the village at that time. And so those transformations, those conversations are happening transnationally. In other words, they're not just happening within, let's say, the community that lives in New York City, but they are writing back to family in Lebanon, and they are publishing articles and letters in the Arabic press, whether it's in Egypt, in Cairo or Beirut, and there are debates happening. And so it's really interesting, that kind of dynamic that I talked about, this kind of connection, especially when it comes around the issue of gender. And this idea of masculinity, so we're not only just talking about the change in women, but the question of what does it mean to be a man is being also challenged, right? Let's say, for example, a man isn't capable of bringing in enough money to make the family's life as comfortable as he thought he would, and the woman is doing better. What happens then, right? What happens to that idea of anarjel, this kind of masculinity that we're talking about? So there are changes and transformations that are happening there as well. So I think you begin to see a shift a little the gender relations.
I have a question, and I have been dying to ask this question from the beginning. So you mentioned that Akram at 17 had, or starting 17, had like some causes, revolutionary causes or whatever, like reasons, things that you were thinking to fight for when you were young. And this is the last question, but I'm so curious to know, what were those causes and what cause do you still fight for today? Besides, of course, being a good representative of what is the immigration. Okay, so the question is the following. Like you said that in your 17, 18, when you arrived, you were thinking about a lot of causes, or you were fighting for a lot of causes.
Oh, political activism.
Exactly. Political, social.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of things. One is, a lot of social issues began to emerge and began to sort of raise questions. I remember a conversation because when I went to Cal Poly, there was a group of Lebanese, and we're talking about, there were 11 guys and one woman studying, all studying engineering. And The question that I sort of pose is like, why is it that, I don't mean to be crass, but why is it when a guy sleeps with a lot of women, he's considered a stud? And if a woman sleeps with a man, she's considered to be a fallen woman. I wasn't asking it because I was being smart or intelligent. I really was puzzled. I could not understand what the deal is. And I remember having that conversation. So I think for me, that was a very important issue. I just could not understand the gender relations as they were. They were not making sense to me. It seemed incredibly sexist and incredibly patriarchal. And not because I sort of like was some feminist or anything. I'm not that I think there's anything wrong with being that, but I really was mostly curious. And so for me, it's those kind of questions about social things. Absolutely. But even beyond that, it's like, as I said, I began to see myself more than just a little kid from Lebanon. I became an Arab. In many ways, when I came to the United States, I became an Arab. Because for a lot of people in the United States, they could not differentiate anyway. But I also became concerned about the issue of Palestine because I had one view of it in Lebanon, because obviously the Lebanese Civil War, well, in the household I grew up, there's a very negative view of Palestinians, that they were the cause of the problems and on and on. My father was a Lebanese nationalist. And again, it's not that he was 100% wrong, 100% right, but that's what I grew up with. But when I came here, the distance, I started asking questions about it that I didn't feel satisfied. So I think that becomes another issue, is that I became an Arab that begins to argue for these things. And politically, I became a leftist in many ways. And sort of there was a shift in terms of my politics, in terms of things. Because I think what ultimately for me, immigration was, it seemed to me there was an effort to rob me personally of my humanity, and as an individual, as a human being, as an Arab. But also I began to encounter in the United States racism against a whole lot of people, right? African Americans. We're not the only group that was regarded that way. And so I think you begin to see that as a story that is much larger than Lebanon, but as a story between the global North and the global South that we exist in. And so I think politically I became very active along those lines as well. And in essence, listen, I'm not saying I'm right and everybody else. We all take journeys. And I can say, for example, a lot of my friends, and they are dear friends, I went to school with as engineers, those 11 guys, the 10 guys other than myself, we had arguments about politics all the time, constantly. And some of them are a very different spectrum where I am, and they think very differently. So I think it doesn't automatically mean immigration equals becoming one sort of thing. But I think all of us had to ask those questions. For me, I came up with answers in a certain different way, I guess.
And you kept the same answer.
Huh?
You
Yeah.
kept the same answer.
The funny thing is, absolutely yes. I haven't, interestingly enough, now I could be that I'm getting old and stubborn in my old days, but no, I actually think it's just, as a historian, I think that's what appealed to me about history, is that it's about human beings. And you really cannot be a historian, I would say, without seeing the structural mechanics within societies, nations, and empires that try to oppress people. And I think for me, that is what drives my politics. It's not that I have anything against this or that or this, but I just really abhor any system that is meant to deprive people of their humanity, whether it's racism, whether it's ultra-nationalism, whether it's militarism, or what we are seeing happening in Lebanon today because of our neighbor that has the support of one of the most powerful nations in the world, and it's destroying a place we love. Anyway, so for me, I think there's no doubt, and I have to say real quickly here before we sign off, because I do have to go soon, it's because of my mother. All of this, honestly, is because of my mother. And I didn't recognize that till I came to the United States, because as a teenager in Lebanon, like, my mom was like, made excellent food, gave me a hug, and that was the end of the story, right? But I didn't realize my mom was shaping me for who I was. My dad was a military guy, Darak, and he was very strict, disciplinarian, expected a lot out of me. And I loved him, I respected him, but he wasn't a person that would just give you a hug. He was a person that you salute in the morning. But my mother, I recognized later, is that both in terms of how she behaved with people, but how she thought and how she read. She was a voracious reader. And she was very quiet, but she would say things so profound in her quiet ways. And I think in many ways, growing up in her kitchen and seeing the women of the neighborhood coming for coffee, I began to recognize very quickly, even as a child, that that's where the center of power is. That these women actually trade information. They are what holds the society together. The men do great work. Some of them are lazy, some of them are not good people. And I'm not saying all women are great, but I recognize that there's something there that if you really want to understand Lebanese society, you understand it in that kitchen when they're making coffee and exchanging stories and making fun of men and their big stupid ideas, especially during the war. And I think I also didn't recognize it growing up, but I recognized it later on when I started taking women and gender studies courses, that my mother in many ways was thinking critically about the system that she grew up in. And she questioned things in ways within the limits of what is, we all exist within limits, but she always questioned things in her own way. And I think that was instilled in me because I spent a lot of time in that kitchen.
I
Eating.
know, I'm sure that she's very proud of you.
Well, unfortunately, much as I would have loved for her to see that, she passed away too early for me. But I think we don't appreciate our mothers enough sometimes.
I lived through this, like being in the US and the year after, so losing my mom.
I'm so sorry.
And same a year after my dad.
Yeah, it's
my surprise, but like my mom, it was a surprise. So yeah.
No, so you both know the pain that comes with that,
Of course.
and not only then are you physically separated, but then the very anchors of your lives are gone, and then you have to rebuild that, and that's very hard. And that's one thing we don't talk enough about in migration studies is emotions. Because we talk about, oh, that kind of stuff is fine, but the reality is we also have to go through a lot of the emotional stuff.
I was talking to my daughter about and I think that's the last thing I'll say before I will let you leave. But I was telling my daughter about my second book and we were talking, and she was like, "Mom, please put some emotions if it's about diaspora. There's not a lot of emotions. Why?" So
No.
I think we lack that.
And that's true. And I think it's something that I'm beginning to explore in my own work because I was trained to be an objective historian, which is a very male approach to history because you're like facts. But we exist in an emotional world. And in many ways, we're not always driven by reason and facts, nor should we be. We're driven by emotions. So rightly, wrongly, it doesn't matter. And so I think that becomes an important aspect of the story we tell about immigrants and about ourselves, which is part of the reason I shared with you some of these things I shared, because I think it helps explain some of the things, right? Go ahead, Sandra.
انتوا عم تحكوا ما هي انه اذا كان واحد من نظرة مثلا بولين كصحفية وكذا، بنجرب قد ما فينا to put aside emotions. حضرتك يعني بمهنتك كهيستوريان، انا محامية كمان ما لازم ابدا ندخل emotion، بس فينا نحن كلنا ما بحركنا الا الايموشن، وقد ما نقول we have to be objective and we are trying to be objective.
Strained family relations, whatever the case may be, or somebody goes every 6 months to Lebanon, that's a very different relationship. And we have to allow that basically means their idea of what it means Lebanese is going to be very varied. And also, they still carry with them the things that they brought from home. They sometimes shift. And so they understand Lebanon in dramatically different ways in that sense. And they have arguments, as I've observed over and over again amongst my friends and colleagues and people I meet when I'm on the road. So I don't think there's a singular thing anymore. And I go back to Gibran's very famous quote, which I think really is actually excellent. I think Gibran sometimes is overquoted because there are a lot of other good literary figures like Amir Rihani or Khayrallah Center. But when he says, that actually is very true in many ways, because when we are all in some ways carry Lebanon as an imagined place. It's real in some ways, but a lot of times we carry it as memories and that are going to be fluctuating. Sometimes they are concrete, sometimes they begin to fade away. And we construct out of these memories, whether it's a faded photograph or whether it's a phone call that we just got, we construct this image. And a lot of times, by the way, when I go to Lebanon, I get rude awakening. It's like this kind of, the more I'm far away, there's more nostalgia. And then I go back and you go through the lines in the airport and the electricity and you're going and all of a sudden there's a rude awakening about that Lebanon is also this and Lebanon is also that. So I think your question really goes to the heart of it. I think it's a very smart question. And I don't think there's a simple answer. And I think in many ways, the journey of many people in the diaspora is answering that question and never getting an answer. Anyway, I have to
Thank you.
apologize. I have to run to my
Thank you
second meeting.
so much. Thank you.
It was so good to see you both. Bye, Pauline.
Bye.